On today's episode of Virtual Sentiments, I talked to Salomé Viljoen, assistant professor of law at the University of Michigan Law School. Salomé walks us through some of the key positions and debates about legal reforms relating to digital privacy and data governance, especially the relational nature of digital data. Among my favorite things about this conversation is how well Salomé balances serious concern for the harms presented by the status quo and the dangers of surveillance with a true desire to also appreciate and try to even increase and improve the benefits that we and our communities can derive from digital data. It's an approach that I think can help us embrace technological change without falling into an intellectually deficient techno-utopianism. Thanks so much for joining us today, Salomé.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
I thought that we would get started, maybe if you don't mind just giving us a little bit of a background to yourself, how you got interested in and developed this expertise that you have in digital economy, as well as digital privacy, data governance, all these issues that I also understand you kind of bring to bear in law, the tools and understanding of political economy.
Yeah, so I really kind of found areas of commercial surveillance through my interest in law school in consumer protection and predatory lending work. So that's as a practical matter, kind of how I found this topic. I was doing a lot of work on various predatory lending tactics and thought I would graduate law school and become a consumer protection attorney, but was just really interested in how strategies and tactics of predatory lending and predatory credit really were at the forefront of very digitally intensive, lot of data surveillance, and even in how those schemes would target people or track people or follow them online. So as a short version, that's kind of how I started to pay attention to this area. And as a larger kind of question, I was always even in undergrad where I studied political economy, I was really interested in questions of economic and political justice and forms of both social, political, and economic inequality. And, I don't know, maybe it seems obvious to people now, but back in my day, people who cared about surveillance and technology were civil libertarians who cared about the government. And I cared about, the private sector and the economy. And so that just wasn't the type of thing that would get me worked up, particularly. Not that I was feeling great about the Snowden revelations or anything, but that wasn't my sort of primary focus or interest in law school or beforehand. But, I think really over the course of me becoming more interested in these topics, as well as just sort of in our general lives, we've increasingly realized that there's so much to the political and economic landscape of surveillance that really ties very deeply to questions of political and social and economic justice. So I think there was just sort of a historical confluence of these events and these realizations kind of happening at the same time that I was really seeing a lot of the things that I'd always been interested in cropping up as technology problems, data problems. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a really great introduction, because I think for a lot of people, there is such a novelty to digital technologies today, to the massive data collection that is so central to so many different parts of the economy. I mean, like you said, it's in lending as well as things like real estate more broadly, and also relating to criminal justice and the sort of everyday way that we experience it when we get ads targeted to us online on Instagram. And everybody thinks that all the companies are listening to them, when the scarier thing is that you don't even need to be listened to directly. There's enough data out there about you that people can make pretty good guesses without just listening in on you. And that sort of old school way of the sort of other visions we had of surveillance, of wiretapping, have been transcended by massive data collection. So I think that that is really, I think that, so I guess one question I wanted to start with based off of how you responded was, in what ways, from your perspective, did you feel in law school and the profession more generally, scholarship more generally, how much do you think that people feel that they can use and they can see sort of pre-existing regulatory regimes and legal approaches, things like consumer protection, like fraud, being potential tools for dealing with issues that are cropping up right now in terms of commercial surveillance and data governance? And how much do these technological innovations require a huge change in the way that we orient our sort of political approach or our way of thinking about what are the issues at hand? Sort of, so as like an example of, you can imagine that there were all these issues with social inequality throughout history. Also, again, sort of relating both to state and private practices. So things like redlining, as an example, we can kind of see those things, and people do make analogies to redlining and talking about sort of digital redlining. And so, is it also about kind of retrieving kind of maybe underappreciated modes of thinking about these issues, or is it totally rethinking the way that we approach these topics because of the technological advancements?
Yeah, so I'm going to give the very law school professor answer of it depends. Um, I, I really think like all of these things are on the table. So particularly when we're sort of trying to like analytically understand like what kind of legal problem is digital surveillance. I really think there are aspects of the problem that are rematerializing and recreating, and in that recreation, maybe like introducing new challenges, old problems that we've had. The problem of how to regulate like worker boss relationships is like an old 20th century 19th century problem of like industrial organization. So things like digital tailorization or like extreme optimization that requires like very intense surveillance of a worker are in some sense digitally recreating old problems that law has like developed we have an entire legal regimes of employment and labor law that fundamentally transformed during the Industrial Revolution from like, regularizing feudal relations to regularizing employment and worker relations. And we're like maybe extending some of those problems or exacerbating them digitally, but those are not like new problems. Some problems I think are, as you said, sort of like retrieving older ways of thinking about things. So, I think one place we're seeing this is like within the context of gig work, particularly with very large technology platforms that operate with significant amounts of market control, people really sort of turning to older traditions of how we thought about market power and antitrust, and sort of arguing that to sort of meet the moment and the challenge of very large tech companies that potentially are monopolies, we actually sort of need to turn to older traditions in law to sort of grasp that problem. So part of that is actually not just like, oh, these are problems that have been around forever and we kind of know how to deal with them forever, but actually, older models that we had actually maybe grasped aspects of this problem better than the sort of more contemporary or recent trajectories that we've had in law. And then there's the third category where I think a lot of the data stuff lives, that I do think is kind of new or requires us to think about the job law is doing in regulating our social relations, which is what law does, kind of anew because of how the political economy of personal information has transformed relatively recently. And so here I'm talking about kind of my core area, which is privacy law. And privacy law really came out of a time before computers. And our earliest privacy law, digital privacy laws are, really crop up in the late 60s and 70s around sort of early computerization. But, I think the way that the law has sort of traditionally conceived of the kinds of concerns we have about information about people being collected and the kinds of rights that we grant people in information about them really are rooted in a world where information just didn't play the role, or, it wasn't like economically and technologically feasible for it to play the role that it plays today. And so that's really a category where I think we do need quite new ways of thinking. But I guess I preface with all the other stuff because sometimes people can be like, new technology, we need to fundamentally rewrite everything. It's like, well, Anglo legal system is very old and has proven very flexible to sort of iterate over time. And a lot of these problems you can kind of fit into that model, but there are sort of a subset of issues that crop up that I do think require quite new thinking.
No, I really appreciate that. And so I guess to be true to the focus of what I think we'll be talking about, I think we might as well move in a little bit to that technological uniqueness, which is more just the basic concept. This is something that I talked a little bit about on earlier episodes of this season of the podcast, but not nearly in depth, not nearly in depth as much as you've worked on. And so that is the notion of the relationality of data, that data as we talk about it often in these conversations, which is often the information collected about people using computers and digital systems, browsing online, for example, but also any kind of transaction using, your credit card is included in that type of thing. That fundamentally, this sort of all these data based business practices and this digital economy are constituted through data that are fundamentally relational. So, what does it mean to think of data as relational as opposed to individualized? And how does that kind of contrast with some of the predominant modes that we see today in terms of how law currently structures, as you said, law structures our social relations? So, in what ways does law structure the way we treat data?
So, very simply, the idea that data is relational is just the idea that information collected about me is almost never in the ways that it's going to be used, in like what motivates an entity to collect it to begin with, just about me. Now, there are exceptions to this. Like if when I like put my fingerprint on my keyboard to like get into my computer, that is like Salome's fingerprint is the thing that lets her into this computer. So that information exchange between myself and my computer is like identity verification. That's like, I am in fact me. Let me into this computer, right? But that's not the vast majority of like why data about people is being collected constantly everywhere, just by everyone who can get their hands on it, and like why it is like the essential input to the digital technology of today. Companies are not following me around with hundreds of cookie trackers and like rapaciously interested in getting my location data because they're extremely interested in collecting all of the Salome information that they could stick in a Salome folder. That information is useful and valuable because information about me is not just about me, it is also about people. Data is about people. And so the more information you have about more people, the more you can understand and develop insight into and sort of distill patterns of human behavior that place us into relations with one another. So my classic example was always like, I am a cat owner. And so the information about me and like things that I buy for my cat isn't just like helpful for knowing, okay, here's like future things we can get Salome to buy for her cat, but it's helpful for painting a picture of like, what are millennial women in Ann Arbor likely to spend on their cat? And like, what are things that we can likely distill about the population of like millennial women in Ann Arbor cat owners generally, right? So now information that's been collected from me is also used to make inferences about or develop insights about or guide decisions about people who share certain features with me. And the cat example is a benign example. Of course, we can think of plenty of less benign examples.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and what is also interesting and what I don't want to get too far ahead about, but it's that exactly that relational nature that also then begins to interact with sort of group classification, as you said. So there might be categories that are much more salient. So I think, you discussed this in your law review article for the Yale Law Journal, a relational theory of data governance. I think a popular one for people to be talking about today is about pregnancy. And that was always, I think, also an interesting case because there were many different cases. Oh, great.
People on the podcast would miss this, but I just pointed out that I am in fact 8 months pregnant. So yeah,
well, congratulations.
Thank you. Yes, can very much talk about the pregnancy example. Have been talking about the pregnancy example. Yeah,
that's great. That's really great. I would love to, because that's an example of something where we've seen various cases of the teen whose pregnancy she hasn't told her parents is revealed to them through a Target ad promo, I think is what it was. And other and I think it was a sociologist. I'll forget her name. I forget her name, but hopefully we'll put a citation in the show notes for this. Who tried to keep all her data about her pregnancy totally to herself, and just like the lengths she had to go to prevent that from being knowable to private companies. And obviously, with now the Dobbs decision, abortion rights and reproductive rights are under threat. And so that interaction between the sort of private data collection and the state is much more salient too, is much more concerning, where people are trying to figure this out. Companies are saying that they're not going to maintain data about location data if, let's say, you go to Planned Parenthood, but then are they actually following through with that commitment, things like that. So I think that that's sort of getting there to then. So how is it that when we think about it as relational and we take these sort of, there's the, less burdensome cases and then the more precarious cases, how does that get us to thinking about data as the way that you put it in your article, as the idea of there being population level interests here? Why isn't it just that, well, one person consents to data getting collected about them, but that ends up having knock-on effects and implications for some third party, some other person who has not consented? So how does that kind of challenge the way that people usually conceive of our rights in these more individualized ways, and show that we have to kind of maybe think of things in a more holistic or social, like you said, population level view, rather than this individualized view?
Yeah. So the pregnancy example is a great example. I mean, it's one that I can sort of speak with some degree of legitimacy when I walk into the room visibly pregnant. But it's been like a paradigmatic example that I've been using for some time because it's so good at really honing in on this concept. So if we have time, I can give you my quick little hypothetical. You can imagine that you're like a person trying to get pregnant using a fertility app. And you're like uploading all of your data in the fertility app, and you're clearly trying to get pregnant. So you're like consenting to sharing all of this information with your fertility app, right? And we can think of that sort of first person as like consenting and uploading everything into your fertility app. This hypothetical fertility app, like a lot of them out there, assures their users, like, we will never sell your information, right? Or share it with third parties. We would never do that. But what they do is potentially partner with other third-party clients, some of which are maybe insurance companies, some of which are advertisers, some of which are in the sort of startup territory of like hiring algorithms, right? To send out sort of like distilled analytic insights about this population of people who are pregnant or likely to become pregnant. And one of those third-party entities sort of uses the analytic insights that they develop from this fertility app, and they link it to patterns in people's, let's say, TV viewing behavior. Because guess what? In the first trimester of your pregnancy, your hormones double every 3 days. So it turns out that, your TV viewing patterns change when you're going through like profound hormonal changes. And so they detect a sort of insight that people who are identified in the first category of app users as likely to be pregnant, they have certain patterns of how their TV viewing changes over time. And they can then use those insights to identify other people who aren't using the app, who sort of evince similar changed TV viewing patterns. And now we can reasonably infer that these people who did not use the fertility app are pregnant or are likely to be pregnant. And they can now be treated as pregnant by the insurance company or the advertiser or the hiring algorithm, right? And so that really is this sort of relational concept that, information collected from this one group of population people, we have now sort of helped to develop a picture of a general population picture of what the behavior of people who are early in their pregnancies are like. And this can be used to gain insight into other people. Pregnancy is also a great example because pregnancy is a really valuable thing to know about someone. Advertisers want to know if you're pregnant because you're about to drastically change all of your purchasing behavior and they want to get to you early. Also, one can imagine the hiring algorithm. Like, look, they may not want to do pregnancy discrimination, but if it's an automated system that's like, which people are about to experience a very expensive and disruptive medical event that's likely to take them out of the workforce for several months. Oh, that's probably going to flag pregnant people. So, it's a really great case study for that. And as you can see, it also really challenges how the law, I think, traditionally thinks of these questions, which is to say, oh, well, all of those people who use the fertility app, like they, we can assume a sort of gold standard consent requirement. Like these apps are really trying to be ethical. They're making sure that you opt in. They want you to know what kind of information you're passing over. And you can imagine a population of those people being willing to engage in that bargain, right? Like they want insight into their pregnancy. And so they're like willing to engage in that trade. The problem is just that, all of the potential downstream impacts of that aren't being captured in that relationship. And at the risk of going on and on, I teach contracts. I teach contracts to 1L students, and contracts, are a really great legal tool or sort of legal institution for regularizing relationships where, I am entering into some sort of binding obligation on behalf of myself. Like I am taking a risk and reward option that has been presented to me, and then I bind myself to it. And sometimes down the road, I don't like that I've bound myself to it, but I kind of bound myself to that, right? But consent and or sort of the quasi-contract idea of like, I'm consenting to this data exchange and therefore it's legally sanctioned, that's just kind of a category error for this sort of like political economy of data, like how it's being used, how it's being applied, right? Because the basic idea that undergirds consent, right, is that I can't consent on behalf of another and they can't consent on my behalf. If I'm going to be bound, then I need to consent on my own behalf. But that's what's happening kind of all the time, like constantly and kind of fundamentally in the data economy, is that we are consenting on behalf of another.
No, and I think that is a really great way to put it. And I think it's also I think what you've also articulated, and what I think is central, is the idea that all of these issues around data, which could be treated as sort of one-to-one contracts, relationships between the user and the company, for example, are fundamentally, shaped by these social and political structures and relations that are going to potentially sort of cascade unevenly according to various inequalities that are existing within society. And so, and in your article, you also talk about things like immigration enforcement and ICE, as well as the Amazon Ring doorbell and all these various private security mechanisms. And so I want to start moving kind of toward, if you could, help us understand, because I think for people who are not, again, like aren't lawyers and haven't gone to law school, what I am struck by though is how much I've encountered these paradigms that you articulate as the sort of predominant sort of proposals for how to reform and think about data governance issues, and how they're very individualized. And it's interesting to me how much these are seeped in throughout academia, throughout our everyday conversations about these topics. People who are interested in these topics, I think, do primarily fit into these frameworks you're discussing, which is what you refer to as the propertarian versus dignitarian frameworks. And I think especially the propertarian one is something I'm very, very fascinated by, because it's something that I probably encounter more. And I will just, I try not to do this too much, but on my cards on table, I'm very skeptical of it as a solution to some of these issues. And I think, first of all, it's because of the relational nature of the data, as you've discussed. The problem is that individualized data just really isn't valuable on its own. It's valuable as a part of a wider social web of, what my pieces of data become more valuable being connected to each other and also connected to other people's data. And so if you were to kind of individualize that, one, I wouldn't be getting much benefit by selling it, but also it doesn't deal with the exact third party consequences that you're talking about. And it also doesn't deal with the fact that I may become implicated. So I think for political theorists, and so again, I mean, for my discipline, for political theorists, I think it feels very reasonable to say, I don't want to be implicated in forms of unethical or oppressive governance, whether it's from a private or a public actor. So when I share my data, I am becoming complicit in various ways and things that might end up harming others, harming people that I respect in my community, right? So that I think is something that doesn't get covered by that. So sorry, I've already sort of put my critiques on the table, but and now I've sort of unfortunately maybe weighed the conversation, but also if you're willing to kind of give us a good faith like kind of summation of the robust argument for like what these claims are, but then also why we might be concerned about that and why that's different from the dignitarian, because I think a lot of times both of these are individualist frameworks, and I think often people kind of mix them when they defend the proposals. But I think it is actually really useful to disaggregate them and then and to show how that relational feature of data as it's used in our political economy doesn't really get, again, it's, you don't even necessarily need to be opposed to these on normative grounds, but they don't really technically address the actual reality, which I think is useful.
Yeah. So I kind of tend to say there are kind of four problems with these approaches, and you can kind of get off the train at any one of them, I suppose. But let me just back up for a second. So yeah, there are sort of like recurring themes that you'll see in how people want to address the problem of like mass surveillance and the data economy. And in my YLJ piece, and sort of just generally, I think my view is that these things are, despite the relational nature of data, tend to sort of revert to the model that we're all extremely familiar with, which is granting legal subjects individual sort of legal rights over that data exchange. And those individual kind of legal rights in the data exchange tend to take one of two forms. There's kind of the proprietarian form, which is, granting me a property interest in my data. And so theoretically, what we're doing there is we're saying, oh, Salome's data is this thing like Salome's cup or Salome's pencil. And so our legal response is that we're going to slot it into the legal regime that we have around Salome's rights over Salome's things. What are sort of basic features of those rights? It treats data as an alienable good that I can now go out and sort of command a price for. And so the sort of fix that we're sort of proposing here is that what's bad about the data economy is that this thing of value is being taken from me, like my cup or like my pencil, and I'm not being compensated for it, and I don't really get to go and like negotiate the terms of people taking my things. So what's a legal fix? We give it property right. Now, again, if you think about data as relational, like clearly problem one is just like we're talking about something that has the features of just like an indivisible kind of common good. So it gets really hard to think about how you would engage in like a good faith principled way of dividing up where Salome's rights end and where, so as I said, I'm 8 months pregnant, I'm going to have a daughter. If I hand over my genetic data, I've now alienated this thing and I've decided it's worth it. But does my unborn daughter like not have any say or a stake? I've just handed over extremely intimate and valuable information that is very much also about her. So, very quickly you can imagine all of the ways in which this gets extremely complicated to work through legally, just in the nature of the good. It's not an easily sort of divisible good. It's a very sort of diffuse, commonly held good, just conceptually. Now, also, as we've talked about, the way it has value is also in that sort of aggregative function. So the chances of it like practically even empowering me much is not that high, because if I insist on a really high price for my data, most practical companies will just be like, okay, fine, but you're like a totally marginal data point on you. We basically can get all of the insights we need about you with the data of the people who share common population level features with you. So like, okay, if you're charging a high price, then like, that's fine. They can figure out everything they need to know about me by just exempting me from the population and running their analysis on it anyway. So we really only have market power to exchange our property as a collective on these population levels. So those are just sort of like practical reasons. What you kind of hinted at is that there's kind of another class of reasons that we might not love these solutions, which is that another kind of feature of the sort of relationality of data is that the risks and the rewards of the way that we're placed into relation with one another aren't spread evenly. And the kinds of populations that we are placed into or constituted as don't all have the same social salience. So, as I sort of suggested, I'm a cat owner. Like, that is like a social category that is maybe totally benign. There's only so much evil you can do with knowledge that someone is a cat owner, maybe, unless you're like a dog owner supremacist group. I don't know. But like, knowledge about my pregnancy and the way that knowledge about my pregnancy might meaningfully reveal sensitive and intimate and useful details about other people's pregnancies in a post-obs world is very different, right? And the risks and the rewards of information being revealed about pregnant people are not going to fall on pregnant people evenly. So, again, I think that this is kind of the people who are going to be tending to exercise their property rights, the people who are going to feel comfortable sort of benefiting from those property rights, are not going to be the same groups of people who are maybe bearing the risks that come from exercising those property rights.
Great. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And so the other I think that's a great way, that's a great summation. And it actually also sets us up very well. I want to make sure we return to the question of pregnancy too when we talk about maybe potentially socially beneficial uses of data that are being foreclosed by these. But before we get there, I actually did want to sort of briefly talk about this alternative approach, which doesn't conceive of data as property, but it conceives of it as this sort of extension of personhood that you refer to as dignitarian. And so that is, I think, because I think for a lot of people who would be skeptical of the property rights framework would be maybe potentially, though, attracted to the idea of this expression of self, the stronger, thicker notion of autonomy that the dignitarian framework offers. But that framework itself, while it has some attention to social inequality and social value, still, in your view, doesn't kind of get us all the way there for dealing with these issues. So I think that would also be kind of helpful to address. But it is similarly, I will say too, I appreciate that you make the analogy to it's related to a sort of natural rights claim, like legal rights as natural rights as persons rather than the right of property.
Yeah. And so it's kind of like the other option. If you're looking at like, I'm a legal theorist interested in granting an individual rights here, you're kind of on like the Hegelian continuum, if you will, of like, is this a thing or is this a person? So having talked about data as a thing, we can now turn to the other side of that coin, which is like, okay, if there are all of those problems of treating data as things, maybe we should really understand and treat data as like an extension of selfhood. And that's actually an old tradition. I think that's like a lot of what privacy law has been up to. If you sort of dig into conceptually and philosophically, the animating kind of principles and concerns of privacy and data protection law is absolutely this idea that there are very core aspects of our selfhood that are implicated in intimate information about us, and our being able to sort of share that on our own terms and bring people into various spheres of intimacy with us. And so in this instance, again, I think there are core privacy interests and data protection interests that do have this feature. They are, I think, necessary predicate goods for a cultivation of selfhood and our ability to then go out and sort of like express our will in the world. But, I don't think that approach captures a lot of what's going on in the digital economy. Again, for the reason that it is fundamentally concerned with like rights that I have qua myself with respect to information about myself. So again, I think that a lot of these kind of relational interests get missed in that view. If we come back to the idea of pregnancy, and as you said, kind of having this right to say, like, I'm being conscripted in a project that I like disagree with deeply politically. An example that I think I use in the paper, or I have in other writing, is this Muslim prayer app that collected location data. And so Muslims could use this app to sort of orient themselves during prayer. They could also use it to like locate stores that were halal in their area, things like that. So there were like reasons for collecting the location data, like that went with the app. Now, a third-party analytics company that app used actually then also aggregated that location data and sold it to a data broker who in turn partnered with the US military to gain access to that information. And what immediately might strike us is that the US military in the past has used location data to identify persons of interest for remote drone strikes. So when we are confronted with this problem, the kind of dignitarian account tells us that, like, let's say I'm a Muslim in the United States using this app to pray. The set of questions we ask is like, well, did I consent to that? And like, am I now is like an extension of my personhood or an extension of my selfhood, like at issue? Did I have control over that information? Maybe we think that the app should have been more transparent in their like communicating that there's third party people who are selling the location. But I think we're still missing, we're providing very thin account of what's potentially normatively troubling to this community in finding this thing out, which is that as a condition of me practicing something that it like makes me a member of this community, which is a Muslim, I am conscripted into placing other people in my community at risk or in danger, or sort of rematerializing what I might plausibly see as like a relationship of imperial domination. That's not about me as an individual, right? And so we're still kind of missing a lot in that dignitarian conception of like, I may not be placed at risk, but I'm being conscripted into the project of another's oppression. That's quite a distinct kind of account of what we might find morally troubling about that example.
No, I think that's really, really well said. And I really appreciate that. And again, and I think it helps get to the also the breadth of the issues that are at heart and just how complex this is and just how yeah, I would say like, I feel pretty convinced by the sort of the as you say the thinness of this sort of individualist account in terms of covering what I think people are also. I think even if I think there's a lot of people who might not realize that this is what they're concerned about and that those frameworks aren't actually getting at the concerns that they have, right? So and yeah, so I think then the next thing I kind of wanted to discuss sort of in tandem with this is getting us to a bit further toward well actually before I get to sort of your proposal and the way that you think of a more sort of democratic rather than individualist approach would look like and what that enables both in terms of critique of current practices and preventing harms but also in terms of enabling potential social benefits that are getting missed. I actually first wanted to kind of ask, but I think for some people who would be attracted to, let's say, the propertarian claim, I think that they are probably in some ways, some of them might be attracted to it because of the fact that it's making, if you're going to do a legal reform, it's being true to the de facto treatment. So it is in some ways. So I guess what I'm saying is there might be a conservative response that says, well, we appreciate these concerns, but we should be true to the fact that this is how these sort of data, the idea that data has become valuable in this way, maybe provide some insight into the value of the current framework, that it's valuable to treat it as an asset, that will then be used to more benefits for everybody's own good. And so this idea of like, oh, the fact that it's like making what's de facto de jure is part of the appeal of that framework for people. And I guess I'd be interested in sort of your thoughts also in terms of the law more broadly, in terms of, as you said, there is this way that the Anglo-American tradition has some flexibility, and there might be ways that there's a history that we can draw on. So there might be some room for the past. But at the same time, as you said, I still think, like I said, I think there's still this argument to be said for the idea that there's this relationality, all these issues that are clearly of concern for people, including people who have individualist concerns. I think many of them would be concerned. So why would we not kind of just follow, though, that de facto becoming de jure argument? I don't know if I'm articulating this properly because I'm sort of trying to channel something that I'm not quite. It's sort of like a hypothetical argument. I wouldn't say I'm playing devil's advocate, but something like that.
No, I mean, it's a good one. So I kind of I try in the piece to sort of point out that, I think part of what I'm trying to intervene in is that, a lot of staunch dignitarians, I think, are in a sense overly dismissive of the virtues of the propertarian claim. I think propertarian claims, they crop up all the time. And that I think is for two reasons. One is descriptive. I think that, when we are seeing a thing that just kind of descriptively in the world is being treated like an asset by companies, we're like, well, why not just do that, right? This is the de facto to de jure argument. But the other is that I think it's speaking to like a normative instinct that we have that I think is right, which is like the argument of unjust enrichment, right? Like, why are these feudal overlords getting extremely wealthy by sucking up all the data from all of us for free? I mean, this is kind of the tenor of the conversation. This is the conversation we're always having. We're having it in its latest form right now about generative AI. Why do these companies get to suck up all of the public internet, which we all created, and then get massively, well, they haven't figured out how to monetize it exactly, but like clearly Microsoft's $10 billion investment in OpenAI is to figure out how to monetize that exactly. And so that's like a theory of unjust enrichment. And I think the propertarians are putting their finger on a real concern that, dignitarians, because data is an extension of selfhood, they can't say like, okay, well then we'll just pay you for, like we can do like a market unjust enrichment kind of response to, because that's not what we do with natural rights. So, um, so like that kind of inequality, getting something valuable for nothing kind of normative motivation, I think oftentimes gets short shrift in critiques of propertarians and like deserves really serious treatment. So all of that is just to say that like I'm sensitive to, and I think sympathetic to, why people turn to property over and over again. And as like general legal category of property, I'm not even opposed to us having some kinds of property like interests in information. I just think you can't trace those property interests back to individuals. They are a commons that have to be held collectively. So, and this is where I get to the de facto versus de jure point. If you look at how tech companies practically turn data into an asset, it's not by sticking the Salomé data into the Salomé folder. It is exactly by creating and sitting on massive commons and pools of aggregated information. So, responding to that kind of systematic at scale, like sort of massive agglomeration of information by thinking that we're all just going to like trace out our tiny little thread of information, and that this is going to meaningfully reallocate power between you and like these enormous technology companies, I think is not to take the practical lesson of how things are already done in the technology industry. How things are done in the technology industry is the aggregated pool as much information as possible, because it's only valuable as a collective resource, as a collective asset. So that's kind of my response, which is to say, like, I'm there. I want us to be treating information the way that legally, the way that the technology companies and any engineer would understand the value proposition of data, which is not with an individual property interest.
Yeah. That's a really strong response and way, and I really appreciate that. That's really helpful actually for thinking about these issues. And as you said, and you kind of touched on that, the sort of nature of data not being divisible, it's not subtractable, it's not, there's all these features to it that make it difficult to slot it into the private property. Doesn't mean that there aren't property interests or rights that one could bundle up to some degree, but it would have to be in that commons framework, like you said. So now I want to kind of give you the opportunity to discuss more your proposals, your ways of thinking about data in this more democratic sense that do capture it in terms of that commons quality, and as well as sort of, I'm going to kind of put back on the table, remind us about you were talking about with pregnancy, because there are both these population level broader harms that don't get captured by individualizing it too much, like sort of harms to third parties, for example. But there are also these social benefits that we might be foregoing because we don't have access to collectively engaging with our data together. So, for example, I've talked to people about sort of concerns about this with healthcare, that there might be a lot of healthcare insights. I think, yeah. So that would be just sort of help us get into this approach that you're developing.
Yeah. So, I think oftentimes, again, in law, you're either like a health law person who only is thinking about like all the good stuff we could only do if only we could free up all this information, or you're like working on local government and you're like, if only we could get access to all of this information, there's so much good stuff we could do, and then you have that view. Or you're a privacy lawyer and you're thinking all the time about all the horrible things that can happen with information and surveillance, and you're like, it's bad, like shut it down, don't collect anything. And so, again, what I think is really helpful about stepping back and just getting a clear conceptual picture of like what companies are in the business of doing when they're collecting all this data, and like what makes it valuable, not just from like a profit perspective, but like socially and economically, just as a general theoretical matter. Like, what is being illuminated by data? Like, what makes data about other people valuable for learning insights about me? Well, this kind of basic and extremely old social fact, which is that we are social beings who are meaningfully socially constituted, and we are like one another. And that's always been true, but now we have the technology that allows us to like at scale kind of glean sufficiently large amounts of information to actually do something with this thing that's deeply true. As a political theorist, is like something that I'm sure you're encountering all the time. It's like, oh my gosh, like we are social animals, and we do reveal facts about one another because of how we're socially constituted. And that kind of is the background thing that one has to bring into view. And I think that when you really kind of, I mean, that's what makes data relational in some sense. And now you can sort of layer on top of that the social sort of scientific insight that different social categories kind of do different things in the social structure. And some of them are potentially doing good things, and some of them are potentially doing bad things, and how we are sort of socially rematerialized and constituted. And then, of course, how law regularizes those social relations is kind of what we're in the business of evaluating when we evaluate whether or not a data flow is good or bad. And so that's kind of the background picture of what, I think ought to inform both how we think about what is harmful about surveillance and what is beneficial about surveillance. So that was theory talk and it was abstract. Let's get back to pregnancy to think about that. What is it, you brought up the sociologist whose name I also read that piece, but her name is escaping me. But when I've been on like a couple of panels on like privacy post jobs. And what I like to say is that pregnancy will tell on you. You are experiencing like an all consuming, not just like biological event, but also social event. Um, Everything about you is being transformed. And so there isn't this neat category of data that's like, oh, this is your pregnancy data and this isn't your pregnancy data, because the way I'm moving is different now that in Ann Arbor, it's cold and snowy. I'm not walking around as much. Why? Because I'm 8 months pregnant and I'm scared of falling. Like, combined with a lot of other information, changes in my location patterns can reveal that I'm pregnant. What I'm searching for, my search information can reveal that I'm pregnant. As I mentioned, changes in my TV viewing behavior reveals I'm pregnant. Oh, Salome used to go to the bar with her friends after work twice a week, and now she stopped going to the bar with her friends. She's probably pregnant. Like, she used to eat sushi all the time. Now she's not eating sushi. Pregnant. Like, pregnancy will tell on you. Why? Because it is a thickly socially constituted fact about me that I'm experiencing this thing called pregnancy. And so that is kind of the background for understanding both like what might make collection of pregnancy good and what might make collection of data about pregnancy bad, which is to say that like kind of what's at stake here is just the social status of being pregnant in the world. So again, when we're thinking about what might be harmful, it doesn't help to think about certain categories of information being better or worse, or certain things that I can do to stop, sharing pregnancy information. For better or for worse, I am being socially apprehended, perceived, and constituted as a pregnant person. And for better and for worse, if I want to be in a world where it's safe for me to operate and move as a pregnant person, that just is like a political project and a political endeavor. I have to win that world collectively with other pregnant people. And so that's kind of the harm case. The benefit case is that if I look at this world and I just decide to fully retreat and say, okay, no pregnant people are going to let any information about their pregnancy status be collected, and we're going to kind of collectively retreat. I want us to see again, all that is happening with information is that this basic fact, which is that we are social beings being socially constituted, is just being rematerialized in a way that allows us to gain insight into that social status. And we're foreclosing all kinds of potential valuable insights into the status of being pregnancy. So the same information that can anticipate that I'm likely going to be pregnant, I mean, I'm giving birth in March, that would be, you know, bad in the hands of a prosecutor who's interested in prosecuting me if I happen to have a miscarriage between now and March, is also potentially really helpful for like local services in Ann Arbor that want to connect me with like daycare slots and planning the staffing at the labor and delivery department to make sure they have enough people around for all the pregnant people that are planning to give birth in March. As long-term studies of fertility, I mean, we have chronically understudied women's health issues. So I want to, for better or for worse, the risk and the benefit of data collection are two sides of the same coin, because data collection and the terms of data collection and what makes it risky and what makes it beneficial is just irreducibly linked to the social facts that are being revealed about us in the data.
Yeah, no, that's a really great way to put it. And I really love the emphasis on our sociability because it makes it so clear how hard it would be to do exactly as you say, to sort of retreat, withdraw perfectly. And additionally, the idea of, I mean, I think taking that more optimistic view of we want there to be we have understudied women's health, we understudy pregnancy. I mean, there's a lot of rules about pregnancy, about medicines that if you have a disability, you can't be on when you're pregnant. But a lot of those things are all just best practices because there isn't any data to begin with, and there might be some evidence, but it might not be, very reliable. And so, being able to have that sort of mass data collection might actually sort of really improve people's health outcomes in really crucial ways. And so, I do think that we would be missing something if we tried to kind of foreclose and we gain something and seeing how when you treat data as a commons and then work towards these alternative modes of governance that might also allow for either public possibilities, but also sort of collective clubs. I mean, you could imagine users pooling their, group, or, a civil society organization enabling people to pool aggregate data and make it useful in various ways that you can't do as a business, but you can do because people have that kind of stake into it to do whatever it is that people want to learn from the data. Is that sort of a good understanding of kind of this what this model allows us to imagine?
Yeah. So, kind of two things that I like, again, because we've been talking quite conceptually, I think something that I'm always sort of trying to say is, we have sort of a distribution of information that's being collected about us. And I don't think my answer is, oh, we're collecting too much data about people. No, I think it's the distribution of data that we're collecting about people is just out of whack. So we probably know way too much about like my shoe buying preferences, or now in the run up to the baby, like my like onesie buying preferences, and like not nearly enough about, for example, like my CO2 emissions patterns or my water usage patterns. And like that strikes me as potentially super important information to have at a granular level about people as we take 8 billion people and we head into like a climate stressed future. So we want to have insight about how to plan and allocate resources efficiently and change our built environment in anticipation of that. And thickly constituted, like very granular insights into how we live and how we relate to one another could be super valuable in helping us to solve that problem. So from like a legal perspective, how do we design our institutions to sort of maybe tamp down on the like bad, maybe like cool the speculative bubble in like frivolous and maybe good for advertisements, but like ultimately probably not that socially useful, and really like facilitate the like socially useful but probably underutilized information collection. And again, like that's about changing the distribution and the patterns of how we collect information and for which purposes. It's not throwing up more legal roadblocks or more limits on information being collected generally or sort of, writ large. And so again, I think one thing that I'm trying to do here is to say, so far what we've designed is a whole bunch of like data spigots and my ability for me to like turn it on and off. And I think we should move away. I don't think we should get rid of data spigots entirely. There's like some stuff that I should still be able to turn on and off. But how do we think about moving from a world where we're like really trained on giving me either property rights or dignitarian rights that are like individual spigot rights to rights over the data pipes? Like me and my neighborhood, we all have kind of like a collective stake in the city main running up and down my road. How do we give me sort of rights of representation and rights of standing over the infrastructure, over the data pipes? And that can kind of facilitate, like you said, like entities offering data pipes that are very transparent, purpose limited. They're making a clear use case that if you pool your sensitive pregnancy information here, we're going to hold it in this technically secure environment. We're going to grant access to medical researchers for like vetted, like IRB proposal kind of vetted medical research. That's like, and we're going to give you sort of like a meaningful say over that data, those data pipes. Like that's now making a very different kind of claim about the rights and the control that I have over my information than just sort of saying like, okay, I'm granted with this kind of consent right and I can give it to a number of entities.
No, great. And then one concern I think that I have, and I don't know, and I, like I said, I don't think that's entirely only means public trust, like public data trust, but that is one example. And so sometimes I think I've seen people be concerned about, again, so back to that more civil libertarian approach of the concern of the sort of state power. But I also think sometimes we have to kind of get straight exactly what public data trusts are and what are the sort of limitations. How can they be designed in ways that reduce the threat of kind of state forms of oppression?
Yeah. So kind of a number of approaches there. Yeah. There's nothing in the sort of legal insight that this is the kind of right that's better handled collectively than individually that presupposes that that collective needs to be the state. We have actually most of our legal collectives are the state. Corporations are just like a collective entity that are collectively run and managed. Trusts are collective entities that are collectively run and managed. So, that might be something for a particular usage or for a particular demographic that like seems like a better conceptual response to the sort of descriptive facts than the state. I think I obviously, or maybe it's not obvious, but I do think there is a role for things like public trusts or like public collectives of information. And again, we have all kinds of models to draw from there in thinking about how to manage the risks that come with sort of public management. One is that, like, as again, legal scholar, that's like there's all kinds of greater state management or oversight over a resource that exists before you get to like full scale nationalization. Like once we say like, oh, this is a public interest, like we have a public interest in data, like that doesn't necessarily mean that like we now want the U.S. statistical agencies to just like take over the metadata servers. Some people might want that, and like that is consistent with the account. But like, you can imagine all kinds of sort of greater forms of public accountability, public oversight that we could implement that are like a far cry from just like full nationalization. And so that's sort of one way to insulate this is that you can say, okay, you can collect information about people for 15 years, you're allowed to exploit it. After 15 years, you have to donate it to a public data repository. So the Institute for Quantitative Social Science here at the University of Michigan, or is that, I mix up my social scientific institutes between Harvard and here because I also used to work at Harvard. But anyway, like universities have like repositories of information. They are at Michigan is a public university. It's run by a bunch of academic data scientists who manage academic data sets. You could just imagine that after 15 years, you either face a steep tax penalty or you clean up and turn over the data for public academic research to be managed by an academic institution. And if it turns out that the information you were collecting about people is like not useful for social scientific research or it's extremely sensitive and risky, then it goes through like an assessment, an audit, and like very dangerous, sensitive information about people gets deleted, which by the way is a higher requirement than we have right now for companies that can just sit on that information indefinitely. So, I think there are lots of examples to draw on here in both the public and the private realm.
No, I think that that's great. And I think that's very, very helpful. And I think it's also, I do think it gets at something that's very challenging with all of these issues, with those types of questions too, is that there is still always a larger. So, one example that people would be concerned about with in terms of the history of public management of data would be the use of census information by the US government for the internment of Japanese Americans, Americans who were caught up in that internment. And what strikes me is that actually, so what I was going to say is just how important in a lot of these cases, the anonymity is that not allowing the people who are to be identified in various ways, but that's a practice that can be crucial for the private collection as well. Just as you said, you can have those types of issues going on right now that then become accessible to the state without necessarily any kind of oversight either.
Yeah. So, I think I kind of have like and this touches on a point that you kind of had raised earlier, and that I don't think I really responded to fully, which is like the civil libertarian concern. So I kind of have like a dark answer and then a less dark answer. My dark answer is that we should not be consoled or comforted by some sort of public private divide if we're worried about like rogue public agencies wanting to get extremely sensitive information about us to misuse or like identify us for oppressive reasons. Because guess what? Data brokers own all of the information they need to get access to you. And those entities or agencies can simply buy that data on the private market right now. So, like, we don't escape the civil libertarian problem by only worrying if the state holds on to this information, because we have an entire private sector that it is extremely valuable for them to collect and sell this, or like sell access to this information. So right now, like if we were to like live in the world we live now and the Japanese internment camp problem were to happen, if the census adopted the differential privacy that they did in the 2020 census, and so they weren't actually able to like individually identify any Japanese Americans, the US government could identify everyone who's Japanese American through 23andMe and like one data broker. So that information is already out there and it is readily available and purchasable in the private sector. So that's kind of my like dark response. My positive response is that we possess a lot more rights against public entities than we do against private ones. Our constitutional rights are rights we have against the state. So if we're concerned or we like think we, want more rights about data, actually from like a legal perspective, those rights are rights we have against state actors. They are not rights we have against private actors. Now, again, I don't mean to dismiss or like be glib about the concern about states. Those are just sort of like two things I like to point out. I mean, the final thing is that, again, I think there are particular entities or particular reasons or particular kinds of information or particular state agencies that like we should be very concerned if they gained access to information. But again, I think a lot of the principles of like good and responsible design over data governance to sort of purpose limit, to make sure that we're sharing information only as needed, to make sure that we have like democratic legitimacy in the information that we are collecting and that it is being shared for, are things we can do and have done around public data infrastructures.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think it's really important for people to realize, because I mean, we do have all these issues already with the way that the data is accessible. So it's not really something, yeah, I completely agree. And so the other thing I actually was hoping, sort of inspired by our conversation, is to think more broadly then about how we might kind of rethink privacy as well. So some people, there might be some sense for some people that privacy is this like very individualistic notion too, that it's this idea of, oh, individuals having their own kind of, like I have my own person. It's sort of related to that personhood kind of notion of, it's like I need this a sphere around myself that I can control and that enables my self development in important ways. But like you were saying, this sociable nature of people make that kind of, I would say, dubious in some degree, because it's exactly, we are like, no man is an island unto himself. Like we are socially constituted. I actually really like George Kateb he's a political theorist who had a 2001 article before 9/11, which is really striking, about privacy and about surveillance and the rise of surveillance technologies. But one thing I really struck is, even though he's an individualist thinker, he talks about how privacy is something that we value because of our relations with others. It's something that enables us to have these forms of relationships, intimate relationships, but also, various relationships with each other. And that sociability that you were talking about is actually part and parcel of why it's really hard to deal with privacy as a political concern, or surveillance as a political concern, because the way he puts it is that, most of us would rather be watched and known by anonymous forces than not watched or known at all. And so there's sort of this double-edged sword of the sociability where people might not be concerned about surveillance, whether it's from a private actor to a public actor, because of just how much we desire human connection with each other, and also the desire to kind of be acknowledged and seen and a part of this broader social world together. But at the same time, again, when we want privacy, I don't think it's just because, like, I want to be able to be pregnant, to celebrate that online, to celebrate that with my friends and family, and not have these concerns that because I'm using these technologies to mediate those social experiences, that then I might be subject to various things. Or also, like you said, I'll be complicit. If even if I am safe, I might be complicit in the prosecution of others, and other kind of marginalizing effects for others. So yeah, I guess that's more. So those are some thoughts that I was thinking about. But I was just sort of curious for you, how do you think kind of beyond the legal paradigms, but more in terms of socially and politically, why is it that a democracy would value privacy? How should we think about privacy in these kind of deeper ways?
Yeah. So I love getting some political theorists reading recommendations from my sort of corner of the world, people that I think have written really compellingly about the role of privacy in democracy. Priscilla Regan kind of makes the point that her defense of privacy very much is one that it's essential to the functioning of democracy, that we feel sufficiently safe to kind of like cultivate our sense of self as like political citizens, or like members of political groups or members of political identities. And that, a world in which there's like a world in which one of us lacks privacy is a world in which none of us have privacy, or a world in which none of us have privacy is a world in which like we don't kind of have the necessary preconditions to kind of come together as a democratic polity. So she thinks that there's like a very deep connection between privacy and democracy. Other people write about like, if you live in a state of complete surveillance, that has clearly chilling effects. And so that's kind of like another approach people take to democracy and privacy. Your point about kind of the ways in which we have like social norms of like we want to be able to share information within certain contexts for certain purposes, and that it shouldn't feel like an all or nothing proposition. I think the work of Helen Nissenbaum on contextual integrity really captures that concept, right? And so there's this idea, Helen Nissenbaum's theory of privacy as contextual integrity really is that privacy is the sort of normative state of not no information flow, but an appropriate information flow. And what makes an information flow appropriate has to do with like the context that sort of structure the sharing of that information. So again, the pregnancy example, like me sharing that I'm pregnant with my friends and family is occurring in a context of like friendship and intimacy where I should be able to share that information freely within that context. And what becomes a problem is if I'm now, faced with the choice of either being able to engage in the socially necessary sharing of information to like make up that group, right? To like engage in the activities that constitute that context. And like, in order for me to do that, to like be sociable and like share fun information, gets bundled with sharing that information with a bunch of other contexts that have nothing to do with the reasons that I might want to share the fact that I'm pregnant with friends and family. Or she also talks about, again, like you should be able to share intimate medical facts with your medical provider. It feels weird to say that, okay, well, if you want to share medical facts with your medical provider, you now basically also have to consent with like Facebook and Google knowing that about you. And it's like, those two things don't seem like they have to be bundled together. So those sort of theories of privacy, I think, are touching on a lot of the productive tension between the fact that like sharing of information is part of how we move through the world and like perform our various tasks and functions in the various social institutions of which we're part of. And it sort of disaggregating this idea that it has to be this all or nothing proposition. We either need to be the man alone on the island or be like fully available to the panopticon. Like, no, there are many other sort of, in fact, occurs in the middle of those things. And there are a lot of like wonderful privacy theories that I think capture that concept. A quick coda, I actually potentially like cutting against the grain of a lot of privacy theorists right now. I actually do, this is my like, I haven't fully fleshed out my views here, but I do think of from a legal perspective, as our privacy interests as kind of like individual dignitarian interests that I have in preserving like a little, sphere of selfhood around myself. I just think that there are a lot of other interests that are legal interests and normative interests in information that are not privacy interests, and those are probably those popular. That's kind of how I think of those population level interests. They're probably not privacy interests, but other people would say those are privacy interests. So it's a bit of a debate in privacy theory right now.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense to me, and I appreciate that. And I think it's one of those topics that I think benefits from there being disagreement and different ways of formulating it. I think what's also important is to see, and that I think that across in our information in our conversation. But I think what I really appreciate about your work is that while in some ways you're showing the inadequacies of some predominant ways of thinking about these issues, you're also saying that we should be concerned about that. You're not invalidating the concerns, and rather actually kind of expanding the possibility of concerns that could be covered that aren't going to be adequately covered by those other views. So it's like it's sort of like an additional, like an also an and like a inclusive approach rather than saying that, oh, we should choose one thing over the other. But it might be that actually there might be various values at play here, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily in conflict. They might actually be compatible, and it might be by bringing in these other views and other concerns that you're actually going to have a much more comprehensive approach for the issues around individualist autonomy and privacy and self-development. That I think, yeah, is both true to the technical feature of data, that its value comes from its relational, and if you see that as a technical, though it's also constituted by law and policy too. But also the idea that human beings are relational, that are the way that we are sociable, is becomes an inevitable factor in all of these processes too. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah. So, I think that a lot of what motivated me to kind of take this view, other than just kind of being curious about like what was actually happening or why I felt like there was such a disconnect between the kinds of legal tools we reach for over and over and the actual like technical and political economic happenings in the digital sphere, really was, I was interested in trying to develop an account that could capture things that we find troubling or problematic about digital surveillance, but that also, the same account, held open the capacity for us to do good, empowering, useful things with this technology. So to your point, I'm really not trying to minimize, because I also deeply care about a lot of the ways that digital surveillance can like recreate or amplify forms of harm. But I wanted to kind of really develop an account that was able to express and index those harms while also kind of holding open the capacity, at least theoretically or politically, for doing good with data and with the types of insights it can reveal about us. Because again, I think that there is real potential for good here. And then sort of proceeding from that story or like picture of this political economic activity, to then to think through our legal institutions. And the effect that has for me with respect to privacy is that, I do care about privacy. I just think that when we're trying to like overload all of these things into the concept, it can oftentimes kind of weaken the argument for it, or like it's just like under too much hydraulic strain, and what we're like demanding of it or asking the concept to do. Whereas, I think if we're so that then you are kind of stuck in the world where like it becomes such a big thing that you either like shut way too much data, way too many data flows down, or you allow far too many. And so thinking about it in terms of that like magnitude just seemed like the wrong, it seemed to do a disservice to, I think, the virtues of privacy. And if you could sort of narrow down and get specific about what those legal interests are, and then open up room sort of proceeding from the sort of conceptual account of kind of like a relational story to think about other legal tools, other legal institutions. We have, as we sort of touched on in the conversation, all kinds of legal institutions and mechanisms to manage collective interests and rights. They just don't usually take the form of an individual consent right.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that that's great. And I think I think that this is actually very useful and something that would be helpful for, I think, more people, because all of these topics are increasingly very popular in all different disciplines. I taught a class on data ethics, and philosophers increasingly work on AI ethics and all these issues. But often it seems like the sort of consent concern is like the most common like way that everybody's thinking about them. And I totally appreciate that idea of, we don't want to just slot everything though into privacy. Like we might also want to think about privacy beyond consent, but we also might want to think that we're not going to be able to capture everything even as we expand it or problematize those sort of assumptions. Well, Salome, you've been so generous with your time, and I could talk to you for hours. I love talking to you. So thank you so much for sharing all your insights, for being so clear and engaging with really a wide range of questions, both from the normative, the conceptual, and to the more concrete, getting kind of more in the nitty gritty of things. So I really thank you so much for being generous with us today.
Yeah, you're very welcome. I really enjoyed being able to talk with all of you, or I guess the one of you.
The collective us at the podcast. Thank you. Thank you so much. This conversation ties in nicely with some of our past episodes from this season, especially my conversations with Christopher Coyne on surveillance capitalism and with philosopher James Goodrich on data monopolies. So you might be interested in those if you enjoyed this one. But to recap, we got to dig into the relational nature of data and how that affects proposals for reforms concerned with improving our control over our data and digital privacy. Information collected about me or you online or through other computer-mediated transactions, such as credit card purchases, is valuable in a networked manner because it can be connected to other sets of information about us and be aggregated with information about others. This is how tech companies have derived value from data for a long time. Information that I provide can be used to deduce traits about others who have not provided information to a given app, website, or organization collecting data. I really liked Salome's way of putting this, that we are really consenting on behalf of others in this case. Additionally, this makes it difficult to give me a property right in my data because it's not particularly valuable individually. And if I don't provide my data, companies and the government can make inferences about me based on information that others provide them. They don't necessarily need me to directly participate. And so that lack of individual value means the individual user doesn't have a lot of bargaining power. Salomé also reiterated some key points about the nature of data as a non-rivalrous good, that it can be something that can be held collectively without any loss in value, whether that is a trust operated by a public authority or a collective of users in all sorts of forms of organizations. As I mentioned at the end of our episode with James Goodrich, this makes Eleanor Ostrom's work on common pool resources a popular topic in our work and our fellowships here at the Hayek program, a really relevant resource for thinking about data governance and specifically data commons. Now, there's some key differences between Eleanor Ostram's common pool resources, which were subtractable arrival risks, could be subject to scarcity and data. But in short, Ostrom transcended the dichotomy between resolving collective action and governance issues through either, on the one hand, state intervention, top-down intervention and control, versus, on the other hand, individualized markets and private property rights on the other. By exploring the more complex ways that actual people had figured out so-called tragedy of the commons problems on their own in all sorts of institutional environments. There are particular cases and social groups who are vulnerable and where the consequences of surveillance are uniquely dangerous or especially dangerous. We discussed pregnancy, particularly in light of today's political environment where women who have miscarriages and abortions are at higher risk of criminalization. And as Salomé pointed out, while there are key differences between public and private forms of surveillance, today, one of the major issues that we see is how easily the government can purchase data from private companies, therefore no longer need warrants to build up evidence against potential suspects of criminal inquiries. This is a a way around our constitutional protections for due process. And groups like the American Civil Liberties Union work on trying to correct and remedy these problems. We also discussed Janet Vertesi's 2014 My Experiment Opting Out of Big Data Made Me Look Like a Criminal, where she talks about the difficulties of concealing her pregnancy from companies. Salomé also discussed the case of a Muslim prayer app, which users use to orient themselves toward Mecca during prayer and seek halal food locations, which, unbeknownst to them, ended up selling location data to the U.S. military, causing chilling effects and exacerbating pre-existing political threats that Muslims face due to America's domestic surveillance and drone warfare. We've provided a link to Salomé's piece on this, Data Relations, for the magazine Logic, as well as her other works that we discussed in our show notes. I also just want to end by emphasizing Salomé's points about how, just as we should be concerned with mitigating the risks of data collection and surveillance, we should also be concerned that we might be missing out on potential forms of innovation by users and researchers because of the current system and the data monopolies that we discussed with James Goodrich. It reminds me of the complexity of privacy as a value itself. I don't think we should always think about privacy as simply the protections we have to withdraw from the world to keep us safe and avoid risk, but instead about something that enables us, something that creates environmental conditions in which we can better learn from and collaborate with each other and build trust. Indeed, one of my favorite themes in Eleanor Ostram's work is, while she emphasized mutual monitoring as an important feature of most common pool resource governance schemes and communities, she also did emphasize that excessive monitoring can erode trust, that surveillance erodes trust, and therefore undermines the possibility of self-governance. That seems to me one of the central issues at stake, not just in these questions of data governance, but in our political lives more broadly. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Thanks so much for joining us. Till next time.